More than 2 centuries ago, a small group of seafarers braved the South Pacific. Some were looking for a new home, others sought to escape the wrath of a powerful empire. All of them expected to find Eden on Earth, and eventually, well, they found it. It was a spent volcano rising from the azure waters of the vast ocean, apparently impervious to approach, but ultimately, it was fit to welcome their small community. It was their home, their paradise, and it would remain so for generations of their descendants, all bearing the surnames of those initial settlers, the legendary mutineers of the HMS Bounty. But even the most luminous of promised lands is not free from shadows. Life in paradise does not come for free, and somebody has to pay the price. Today is the story of Pitcairn Island. Alright, let's start with some basic geographical facts, shall we? The Pitcairn Islands are an archipelago located in the central South Pacific, roughly halfway between New Zealand and Chile. The closest island is Mangareva in French Polynesia, about 482 kilometers to the northwest. The archipelago includes 4 islands, Ona and Dutsi. These are tiny atolls, both uninhabited. Henderson is a raised coral island at the center of a World Heritage Site, also uninhabited. And Pitcairn itself, a rugged volcano island covering an area of only 5 square kilometers and rising 347 meters above sea level. This is the only inhabited island hosting a population of 35 people, mostly concentrated in the capital city of Adamstown. As described by Pitcairn's official immigration website, the majority of Pitcairn Islanders are descendants from the 9 mutineers of His Majesty's armed vessel Bounty, who, led by Fletcher Christian, landed on uninhabited Pitcairn Island in 1790 with 6 Polynesian men, 12 Polynesian women, and an infant girl. These European and Polynesian roots can be clearly seen in the faces and customs of the people of Pitcairn today. Into this mix have come other settlers, whether from other Pacific islands, Australasia, America, or Europe, continuing a tradition dating from the island's earliest history of attracting migrants from other nations and creating a community rich and diverse in its cultural heritage. Now, from an administrative point of view, the Pitcairn Islands are a British overseas territory, the last in the South Pacific. In practice, Pitcairners pretty much rule themselves through a 10-strong island council who appoint a mayor for day-to-day administration. The council works in cooperation with a commissioner based in Auckland, New Zealand, in charge of ensuring supplies and issuing stamps, a much-craved commodity by collectors worldwide. As per the central British government, it handles instead matters of defence, foreign affairs, and criminal law, as we are definitely going to see later. Just before we continue with today's episode, let's talk about something very important, and that's keeping your online activity safe. Picture this, you're at your favourite coffee shop. You're sipping a latte, you're browsing the web. It sounds great, but there's a problem. Public Wi-Fi is like leaving your front door wide open, inviting anyone to peek inside. It's not a great idea, and that's where Surfshark comes in. Surfshark VPN keep all of your online activities private and secure. Now, what's great about Surfshark is that you can connect unlimited devices with one account, so your whole household stays protected. Plus, they've got a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. Also, 24/7 customer service through chat, email, or social media. But there's even more. They've got 3,200 servers in 100+ countries, so you can virtually travel the world. No more restrictions, no more censorship. Want to watch a show that's only available in another country? Easy. Just switch your server location with Surfshark and you're good to go. So, give Surfshark a try and you can get an extra 4 months with the promo code PLACES at surfshark.com/places. Huge thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring, and now back to it. All in all, Pitcairn can be defined as a quasi-state polity, and due to its minuscule population, it is the smallest political entity in the world. And the small population, alongside isolation, its location, and climate, may have contributed to this archipelago becoming a tropical paradise, home to flora and fauna seldom observed elsewhere, if at all. An ornithological expedition in 1991 and 1992 discovered 10 new species of birds, as well as 80 plants which are native to the archipelago. And in 2012, a team led by Alan M. Freelander, National Geographic Society, conducted an ecological assessment of the marine environment of the Pitcairn Islands, finding 51 new species of algae, 23 of corals, and 15 fish. Their findings highlighted, quote, the uniqueness and high biodiversity value of the Pitcairn Islands as one of the least impacted in the Pacific, and suggest the need for immediate protection. In September 2016, in fact, the waters of Pitcairn Islands became one of the world's largest marine protected areas, covering a surface of 832,000 square kilometers, which is about 2 Californias. The history of Pitcairn is inextricably linked to that of HMS Bounty and its mutiny. But the islands had been first inhabited some 6 centuries earlier. The first settlers on Pitcairn Islands were Polynesian peoples, daring seafarers and explorers of the Pacific Ocean. The first parties landed sometime in the 11th century AD, occupying Pitcairn, nearby Henderson, and Mangareva, a large island some 540 kilometers to the northwest. This Polynesian society thrived for some 3 centuries, as attested by the presence of votive statues, burial sites, ovens, tools, and carvings representing human and animal figures. According to the Auckland Museum, the Pitcairn settlers depended heavily on their trade with their Mangareva friends for sustenance. In turn, the Mangareva inhabitants relied on the local natural resources, perhaps a tad too much as the island suffered intensive deforestation. As resources dwindled in the 14th century AD, the Mangarevians engaged in a civil war which disrupted trade routes with Pitcairn and Henderson. Cut off from their main supply lines, the societies on Pitcairn and Henderson eventually became extinct. Pitcairn and its neighbours remained uninhabited for centuries. Certainly, they were completely devoid of human presence in 1606 when they were spotted by Portuguese explorer Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz. The sailor recorded the existence of the islands, but did not settle them. More than 1 century later, on the 17th of July, 1767, British Royal Navy vessel HMS Swallow sailed into the area, claiming the rediscovery of today's destination. Captain Philip Carteret recorded in his log, "It is so high that we saw it at a distance of more than 15 leagues, and it having been discovered by a young gentleman, son to Major Pitcairn of the Marines, we called it Pitcairn's Island." The young gentleman was Midshipman Robert Pitcairn, by the way, and he was just 15 years old at the time. 3 years later, he received a promotion on board an East India Company vessel, but the poor lad disappeared during a storm in the Indian Ocean. But back to Carteret. After spotting the island, his crew attempted a landing, but the high cliffs and violent surf prevented them from making an approach. Carteret's report sparked the interest of none other than Captain James Cook. The famous explorer searched for Pitcairn, but an outbreak of scurvy prevented him from reaching his destination. It was the age of sail and empires, however, and it was only a matter of years before some Brit showed up, took a look at things, and said, yes, I'll have that. Yes, please. Normally, the Brit would be doing this in the name of the crown or some sort of giant corporation. But in the case of Pitcairn, a group of desperate, mutinous sailors would claim the island as a home for themselves and themselves only. HMS Bounty had left England in October 1787 under the leadership of Acting Captain William Bligh and his deputy Acting Lieutenant Fletcher Christian. Their mission, collecting breadfruit plants from Tahiti and taking them to the West Indies. There was nothing bellicose about this Uber Eats-style mission, but Captain Bligh had good reason to enforce a military-like discipline on his crew due to the length of the journey and the ever-present risk of malnutrition, alcohol consumption, and disease outbreaks. After an exhausting 1-year-long trip, the crew landed in Tahiti on October the 26th, 1788. During the ensuing months, Bligh's men proceeded to acquire and store hundreds of breadfruit trees, all the while making an important discovery. Tahiti was, and is, pretty awesome. A veritable Garden of Eden, blessed with delicious food, covered in luscious vegetation and inhabited by friendly locals. Some of the sailors in particular became very, very friendly with the local ladies. At least 18 of them had to seek treatment for venereal diseases. Among them was Lieutenant Christian, who formed a stable relationship with a Polynesian woman called Ma'atwa. The pleasures of Tahiti led to a gradual decline in discipline, which Bligh suppressed with harshness. By early April 1789, it was time to leave, and the Bounty set sail towards the West Indies. But Fletcher Christian and 24 other sailors were not thrilled at the idea of leaving their slice of heaven behind. On April the 28th, Christian staged the notorious mutiny, arresting Captain Bligh and 18 sailors who were not a part of the plot. The 19 men were forced to drift away on a small boat with scant provisions, but Bligh was an excellent navigator and was able to sail the tiny launch to safety. As for Christian and his rebels, they returned to Tahiti, where they split into 2 factions. 16 of them wished to stay on the island, but Christian and 8 other men feared the inevitable arrival of a British punitive expedition. If they wished to remain free, they had to board the HMS Bounty once again and sail off in search of their very own new paradise. And so they did, accompanied by 19 Tahitians, of which 12 were women, 6 were men, and there was also an infant girl. After exploring the Cook and Fiji Islands, Fletcher Christian had a bit of inspiration. How about settling on that small remote island once sighted by some teenagers serving with Captain Carteret? And so, on January the 15th, 1790, Christian's sailing party reached Pitcairn, and they were delighted to find it empty and fertile. They set anchor in what is today Bounty Bay, and then unloaded its cargo of pigs, chicken, and sweet potatoes, hauling it up an incredibly steep slope aptly named the Hill of Difficulty. Finally, to eliminate any sightable trace of their presence, they set the Bounty on fire. The small community set to work to build their new homeland under the leadership of Fletcher Christian. According to all reports, the former lieutenant was mild, generous, and sincere. And well-educated too, as he had been a schoolmate of poet William Wordsworth. Under his direction, the Pitcairn community built the village, which would later become Adamstown, and started to thrive. But for heaven to flourish on such a small, isolated speck of land, somebody had to pay the price. In this case, the outnumbered and outgunned Tahitian men, who were treated almost as slaves by the 9 mutineers. A small but violent revolt eventually broke out in 1793, which ended in the deaths of the 6 Tahitian men and 5 mutineers, including Fletcher Christian. During this period, 2 of the Tahitian women also died, but the causes are not recorded. If we were to consider Pitcairn as an independent country at this stage, we may consider this the most lethal civil war in history, as it killed off 73% of the male population. Christian's mantle as leader of the community was picked up by former midshipman Edward Young, now in charge of a community which included 3 further mutineers, 10 women, and up to 23 babies and toddlers. The oldest of those children was Thursday October Christian, by the way, son of Fletcher, and the first baby to be born on Pitcairn. Pitcairn remained casualty-free for about 5 years, until mutineer McCoy made a life-changing discovery. The roots of the local tea plant, or Cordyline terminalis, could be brewed into a potent liquor. McCoy enjoyed the brew so much that he eventually fell off a cliff while intoxicated and drowned. It was now down to 3 survivors of the bounty: Young, John Adams, and Matthew Quintal. One day, the latter attacked the other 2 following a dispute and was thus killed in self-defense. Then it was time for Edward Young to go, lost to a bout of asthma in 1800. Now John Adams was the only man in a community of 10 women and 23 children, and while not as educated as his predecessors, he proved to be a competent and fair administrator of island life. Adams laid out plans to rationalize the future Adams town, styling it after an English village but with Polynesian architectural elements. Likewise, clothing, implements, and cuisine evolved in a peculiar Pitcairn style, mingling Tahitian and British influences. In 1808, the Pitcairn community was discovered by Matthew Folger, captain of an American sealing ship. His report, however, was ignored by Britain, preoccupied with a little nuisance at the time called Napoleon Bonaparte. In September 1814, 2 Royal Navy vessels stumbled upon Pitcairn by total chance. According to the official website of the government of the Pitcairn Islands, the astonished British commanders were charmed by the physique, simplicity, and piety of the islanders. Favorably impressed by Adams and the example he set, they agreed it would be an act of great cruelty and inhumanity to arrest him. From then on, Pitcairn became a regular stop for British vessels sailing the South Pacific, a connection to the wider world which greatly benefited the locals. Every moored ship presented an opportunity to barter food in exchange for tools, clothes, even weapons and Bibles. One day in 1823, a ship dropped something more than just goods, though. It was 2 more inhabitants, John Buffett and John Evans, who settled in pretty well. They both had families with local women, and Buffett took on the role of schoolteacher and pastor. By now, the population had risen to 66, and Adams was concerned about deforestation and dwindling local resources. The land had paid its toll, and Adams's flock was at serious risk of starvation. That's why the aging father of Pitcairn filed a request with the colonial authorities in London asking for his community to be relocated to Australia. As he awaited a reply, in 1828 he welcomed an addition to the island, George Nobbs, missionary and veteran of the British and Chilean navies, who took over from Buffett as teacher and vicar. Then, on March 5, 1829, John Adams died at the age of 62. The reply he had been waiting for from London arrived only 2 years later, when the Pitcairn Islanders, now 77 in total, were offered to relocate, but not to Australia, instead to Tahiti. The descendants of the bounty mutineers and the Tahitian women were given a warm welcome in March 1831, but their heavenly islands of their ancestors proved lethal. Years of isolation had made the Pitcairners vulnerable to infectious diseases. In the span of 2 months, 12 of them died, including Thursday October Christian. The Tahitians were sympathetic to their plight and immediately sought solutions to repatriate the 65 remaining Pitcairners. American whaling captain William Driver offered to take them back home, but he demanded a charge of $500, that's $18,000 in 2024 money. The Tahitians stepped in once again, helping their guests in raising the necessary funds, and by September 1831, they had all returned to Pitcairn Island. This misadventure was followed by a period of lawlessness, as the locals indulged in too much drinking. Missionary George Nobbs attempted to establish his authority as leader, but was not accepted as such by the population. In October 1832, a British government envoy, Joshua Hill, landed on the island with the appointment of President of the Commonwealth of Pitcairn. Hill soon abolished the distilling of liquor and re-established order, but in doing so, imposed a set of draconian punishments for the smallest of infractions. Nobbs attempted to contest his rule, but he was expelled from Pitcairn alongside other opposers. Essentially, Hill had established his own little mini-dictatorship on the island. Dissent grew until, in 1838, a scandal erupted. It appeared that Joshua Hill had no official appointment from London and was little more than a con man. The islanders removed him from Pitcairn and recalled Nobbs as pastor, schoolmaster, and overall leader. The bad experience with Hill led the islanders to a conclusion. They needed protection, and for the sake of protection, they were willing to forego their independence and join the British Empire. In November 1838, Pitcairn leaders enlisted help from Captain Elliot of the HMS Fly to draw up their constitution. The body included some pretty advanced concepts never before seen in British legislation. For example, the island was to be ruled by a chief magistrate to be elected annually, quote, by the free votes of every native born on the island, male or female, who shall have attained the age of 18 years. For context, universal suffrage for voters aged 18 and above was introduced in the UK only in 1969. The new constitution was signed into effect on November 30th, 1838, thus formally incorporating Pitcairn into the British Empire. By 1856, the colony had largely expanded to 194 islanders, and resources again became a concern. A new relocation was organised, this time to an uninhabited island, to avoid a repeat of the Tahitian experience. The choice fell on Norfolk Island, almost 6,300 kilometres to the west of Pitcairn. Thus, George Nobbs led the entirety of Pitcairn's population to their new home, which most found to their liking. As a former penal colony, Norfolk enjoyed a decent level of infrastructure, arable lands, and herds of domestic animals. But it was not Pitcairn. 5 families, amongst them the Christians and the Youngs, suffered the pangs of nostalgia, and by 1864 had returned to their ancestral seat at Adamstown. The population had now dwindled to 43 and suffered a period of intense isolation. In the previous decades, Pitcairn had been frequently visited by whaling ships, up to 40 a year, which presented an opportunity to exchange goods and see some new faces once in a while. But the heyday of whaling in the South Pacific was now gone, and Pitcairners were lucky if they could sight a dozen ships a year. These vessels included the occasional Royal Navy ship, whose reports helped keep alive the legend of the descendants of the bounty among Victorian society. The children of Pitcairn were depicted almost as angel-like, uncorrupted by the civilized world, whilst living according to the pious teachings of the Church of England. Their peculiar way of life also attracted the attention of Seventh-day Adventist missionaries who saw an opportunity to spread their teaching to the South Pacific. The first contact took place in 1876, when missionaries James White and John Loughborough sent a box of Adventist literature to Pitcairn, which left a deep impression. The book delivery was followed by the visit of Adventist layman John I. Tay, who spent 5 weeks on the island in October and November of 1886. Most locals had been converted, and an enthusiastic Tay returned home to California to organize a second expedition. The General Conference of the Adventist Church funded the building of a brand new ship, the Pitcairn, which reached its namesake island on November 25th, 1890. This was another success, with 82 Adventist baptisms being recorded. From then on, the Adventist Church continued its mission across the South Pacific, while one of its ministers, Edward Harmon Gates, stayed on Pitcairn to found a school dedicated to the study of history, grammar, and the Bible. According to senior pastor Alexander S. Curry, writing for the periodical Spectrum, the introduction of Adventism had a positive influence on the small island community, providing a moral structure and a sense of purpose to daily life. But reports of naval officers in the late 19th century spoke of social deterioration, lawlessness, and even cited one case of murder in 1897. According to the official website of the government of the Pitcairn Islands, order was restored through the initiative of James Russell McCoy, great-grandson of the mutineer, who had, drunk himself to death. Quote, McCoy had spent some time in London and Liverpool, and autocrat though he was, in a real sense, he was a link between the old Pitcairn and the new. By the turn of the century, he had restored purpose to the community by enforcing the recently revived laws of public work, and his personal courage and example, which won him respect if not popularity, secured improvement until he began to spend much of his time overseas on missionary work. On August 15th, 1914, the Panama Canal was officially opened, and all ships sailing on to New Zealand would make a stop at Pitcairn. Isolation was a thing of the past now, and islanders would welcome at least one ship a week. This was a boon to the economy, but more and more young men became attracted by the wider world, seeking passage on the visiting ships and relocating to New Zealand or Australia. The islands was not vacated for a third time, however, and those who remained seemed to enjoy themselves. H.R. Shapiro, assistant curator of physical anthropology at the American Museum, visited Pitcairn in 1928, writing an idyllic account. Men and women enjoyed total equality when it came to voting and owning property. Education was compulsory until the age of 16, and all inhabitants contributed to a communal fund for food. Moreover, quoting, the social life of the islanders is very hearty and informal. Moonlight picnics, garden parties, and other gatherings of a social nature are always hilarious. A strong love of music is common, and one of the most generally attended organizations is the Choral Society. In 1956, the island was visited by another scholar, E. N. Furden, writing for the journal Geographical Review. Also, his assessment of Pitcairn and its inhabitants was glowing. He wrote, "If Pitcairn homes reflect a disinterest in general comfort and spick-and-span shelter, the people themselves demonstrate the fundamental character of the town. This is, like the islander himself, clear and simple. The Lord has provided all the necessary material goods of life, and the most important thing left is to get along with one another. No doors have locks, and no one is ever turned away. For us, Pitcairn Island was a succession of lovely pictures, and it was made more delightful by what are probably the friendliest people in the world." Those friendliest people, however, had been hiding certain dark habits from the outer world. As reported by William Prochnow and Laura Parker, writing for Vanity Fair, it appears that British colonial authorities had known about the moral indecency of the Pitcairners since the 1920s, but had failed to act. Magistrates on Pitcairn filed complaints in 1921 and 1938, their main concern being the support of the numerous illegitimate children. As no help came from colonial authorities, local magistrates accepted the fact that widespread adultery contributed to repopulating Pitcairn. Quoting, "These children of the night might have saved the island." During World War II, a pastor on the island filed another complaint with the High Commission in New Zealand, reporting how prostitution and adultery were now commonplace. Which is all okay if consenting adults are involved. But the pastor reported a new detail. The only ambition of young Pitcairn men was to break in the young girls, with the most ambitious wanting to break in all the girls on the island. Such reports were largely ignored or forgotten until 1997, when the British government assigned a police officer to Pitcairn whose mission was to train the local constable. It became almost immediately obvious that local laws were lacking when it came to sexual crimes. In fact, they completely lacked any mention of sexual assault and allowed for adults to have sex with children as young as 12. The British officer discovered that sex with underage girls had been tolerated as a traditional value and started collecting allegations of sexual assault. Social workers were also sent to the island, submitting shocking reports back to London. Quoting again from Prochnow and Parker, they, quote, "began to untangle a society in which sex permeated everything. Childhood sex games were commonplace, as were pregnancies and abortions among young and unmarried girls." Even more disturbingly, quoting again, "early sexual manipulation for comforting babies has been a feature of life for many years." One social worker's conclusions describe Pitcairn as the most dysfunctional community on the face of the planet. More allegations followed as British, Australian, and New Zealander officers conducted further investigations from 1999 to 2001. Detectives interviewed every woman who had lived on Pitcairn in the previous 20 years, as well as several men who had been living on the island or had moved abroad. As a result, prosecutors were able to charge a total of 13 men at the Pitcairn Island sexual assault trials held in Auckland in 2004. 7 of the defendants still lived on Pitcairn at the time, representing a third of the island's male population. Among them was Steve Christian, descendant of the Mutiny leader Fletcher Christian and mayor of Pitcairn. The defendants and their sympathizers argued that their sexual acts with underage girls were part of traditional values and thus acceptable on Pitcairn. At the time, such custom was even defended by the best-selling author of The Thornbirds, Colleen McCullough, married to a Pitcairn descendant. According to Prochnow and Parker, she stated, "It's Polynesian to break your girls in at 12. The defendants also maintained that London had no jurisdiction on the island, as the bounty mutineers had renounced their status as British citizens. Hence, Pitcairn was not actually a British territory. Conspiracy-minded locals even claimed that the whole trial was just a British plot to depopulate the island. All the while, the same locals, including some women, put pressure on the victims for them to withdraw their charges. But the prosecution pressed on, bringing to light horrific details, such as how an 11-year-old girl was assaulted by multiple men, or how instances of sexual assault were often accompanied by violent fights. One victim stated, "I have seen some of the fights. All I've associated with sex on Pitcairn is violence." The trials concluded with the conviction of all but one of the defendants. Another 2, showing remorse, were sentenced to community service. The remaining defendants received terms of 2 to 6 years in prison. All in all, it was very lenient. As reported by the British High Commission in New Zealand, these prison tariffs were, quote, "tailored specifically to Pitcairn and accounted for its unique isolation and population size." So what had happened in the small and apparently friendliest island community? Had the isolation of this paradise gradually pushed its population toward abhorrent sexual practices? The unique and puzzling case of Pitcairn was analysed by Professor John Scott at the School of Justice of Queensland University of Technology and by Dr. Zoe Staines at the School of Social Science at the University of Queensland in Australia. Their findings were compiled in the paper Charting the Place of Islands in Criminology on Isolation, Integration and Insularity. Published in March 2020 by the journal Theoretical Criminology, the authors highlighted how Pitcairn's community displayed a, quote, "strong bonding capital within what might be described as a closed social network." a feature which normally has a strong role in preventing crime. Quoting again, much research in criminology has suggested that smaller, often rural communities have an abundance of bonding capital and are cohesive and friendly places with low levels of crime. As such, they are considered relatively safe. But there is a dark side to social cohesion, as an emerging body of research suggests that remote and rural communities may be plagued by high rates of interpersonal violence. Quoting again, this research suggests that the ecology of rural places and more broadly remote and isolated places can be criminogenic. Or in other words, the high-density social network tying the Pitcairn Islanders together was supportive of crime. This explains how a tight-knit community may be conducive to condoning, perpetrating, and concealing an already established criminal practice. In this case, sexual assault and underage sex. But how did these criminal practices first emerge, and how did they become part of the norm? Scott and Staines argue that, quote, the isolation of the island provided fertile soil for the subversion of British constructions of crime as well as Christian constructions of faith. British law and Christian morals were replaced by a different, stronger force, much needed for Pitcairn to survive. Quoting again, sex was not highly regulated because of an apparent need to procreate and maintain the island's population. Visiting Pitcairn today is a logistical challenge due to the lack of airstrips and its remoteness. But with a decline in revenue from collector's stamps, the island government is investing heavily in tourism. If you'd like to visit what is arguably one of the planet's most peculiar places, make sure you head to visitpitcairn.pn for sailing schedules and accommodation details. Back in 2022, the Islanders even hired a marketing consultant to help sell Pitcairn, who in turn recruited travel writer Brandon Presser to describe life on the island. As reported by the New York Post, however, most locals are still wary of outsiders. This naturally follows the negative attention brought upon them by the 2004 trials. Quoting, within minutes of his arrival on Pitcairn, Presser was accosted at the town deck by an angry local. I don't want you talking to me, coming up to me, or even looking at me while you're here, the man railed. Got it? The Islanders explained to Presser their approach to hospitality, which they called hypocriting, or acting sociable and welcoming without really meaning it. Entrepreneur and travel blogger Christoph Herman, however, reported spending a largely enjoyable time on Pitcairn as he was hosted by one of the men convicted at the trial. It is clear, however, how the repercussions of the scandal are still lingering over the small community. According to The Telegraph, back in June 2019, there were only 3 primary school-aged children on the island. One of them, a girl, was never left alone with island men. The same article reports how in November 2018, Pitcairn had sought to, quote, draw a symbolic line under what happened. They unveiled a reconciliation plaque. The commemorative text reads, to say we're sorry does not seek punishment or blame. It doesn't say they were right and we were wrong, just that we have learned and understand the error of our ways.